The man had been walking for 3 days without water. The cut on his cheek was festering. Gray hairs were creeping up his temples. Dan silently took a can of Sprite out of the fridge and set it on the counter. The man took a sip, and the wound on his face closed right before his eyes. But let's rewind. A second ago, a bullet entered Dan Carter's chest, and now he's standing behind the counter of his own store, looking at his hands. Clean. No blood, no pain, no hole in his chest. The fridge hums behind him. The lights are on. The shelves are packed with merchandise down to the last centimeter. A typical morning at Carter's 24/7. Except for one detail. There's no parking lot outside the window. Outside the window, a hay cart rolls along the cobblestone pavement. A man in a canvas shirt. A man walks beside him with a sword at his belt. A real one. A heavy, jagged piece of metal in a worn scabbard. Dan blinks. He rubs his eyes. He looks again. The cart hasn't gone anywhere. And the stone house across the street didn't exist yesterday. Yesterday, Tony Gregson's car wash stood there. Dan rests his hands on the counter. The wood is real. The scratch by the register is real, the very one he left 2 years ago when he dropped a crate of beer. He presses the button. The cash drawer slides out with a clink. Inside are not dollars. Inside are round, heavy coins made of yellow and gray metal. A man's profile in a crown. A coat of arms with 2 swords and a tower. And right here, by all logic, he should scream, or run, or sit on the floor and rock back and forth. But he stands there, feeling the familiar linoleum under his feet, because his father always said one thing: no matter what happens, open at 7, close at 11. A customer will always come. The clock above the door reads 10 to 7. Dan takes a breath, exhales, flips the sign from closed to open. A medieval street flows past the glass. A woman in a long dress carries a basket of bread. A boy drags a bucket of water. An old man limps along with a cane. No one looks at the shop, as if it had always stood there. Dan rings the brass bell his grandfather hung there. It chimes high and clear, and something clicks inside. Not a revelation, a 10-year habit. The sound of the bell means one thing: the workday has begun. At 10 minutes to 8, the door opens. A man enters, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in dusty leather armor, a sword hilt at his back, a fresh cut on his cheek, dark circles under his eyes. He wheezes that he needs water, any kind. 3 days without water. Dan asks no questions. He pulls out a can of Sprite. He sets it on the counter, shows him how to open it. The can fizzes, the man drinks, and the dark circles under his eyes fade. The cut tightens and disappears. The gray at his temples darkens by 2 shades. He finishes his drink. He lowers his hand. He looks at Dan with eyes free of pain and fatigue. He asks what that was. "Lemon and lime," Dan replies. "0 caffeine." The man silently places a silver coin on the counter. He leaves. Dan twirls the coin between his fingers. Heavy. Real. He jots it down in his notebook. 1 can of Sprite. Price, 1 silver coin. In the notes column, he writes a single word: heels. He underlines it twice. By noon, he finds something under the counter that wasn't there before. A thin book in a leather binding, a phrase book, handwritten on the first page. "Welcome, Dan. The rest will come with practice." Signed, Supplier. Someone knew he would be here. Someone was prepared. And suddenly, Dan realizes he's reading the sign above the door in a foreign language he's never studied. Little Wonders. Customers come in until evening. A woman sniffs a bar of ivory soap and pays 3 copper coins. A boy grabs a chocolate bar and runs off with a look of pure happiness on his face. Dan locks the door at 9. He counts the takings. 1 silver, 4 copper, and he writes a question in large letters. What will happen at midnight? He doesn't sleep. He sits in the dark behind the counter and waits. At 11:59 p.m., the floor shakes, as if a truck had pulled up to the back entrance. The clock strikes midnight, and the shelves fill up. In a single second, every empty slot is stocked again. A can of Sprite is in place, soap in a row, exactly as many as there were in the morning, not a single one more. And on the counter lies a note. Delivery complete. Standard assortment. Signature. Supplier. Dan rubs his face with his palms. He speaks quietly into the empty store. Okay, so here's the deal. I have a store. The shelves are restocked once a day. Outside the window, it's the Middle Ages. My Sprite heals the wounds, and I have an anonymous supplier. He's silent for a second. Then he adds, Dad would be shocked, and Grandpa would have just opened at 7. The second day began with a line. Dan opened the door at 7 in the morning and saw 5 people in front of the shop. They stood silently, staring at the little wonders with an expression he knew well. That's how customers look at a new store in the neighborhood. Curiosity mixed with skepticism. The first to enter was the very woman who had bought soap yesterday. She was with a friend. The woman was pointing at the shelves and explaining something to her friend quickly and excitedly. Dan made out the words. It smells like flowers. My hands feel soft. My skin, smooth. The friend looked at the shelf with the soap, then at Dan. She asked if there was anything for hair. Dan led her to the shampoos. Pantene, Head and Shoulders, Dove. The woman opened the cap and sniffed. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears in them. Dan didn't understand why. Later he would learn that soap in Arden is made from animal fat and ash. It scrapes the skin and smells so bad you don't want to wash. There was no such thing as shampoo at all. People washed their hair with that same harsh soap, or a herbal decoction if they could afford it. A bottle of Pantene for 3 copper coins was something unimaginable to this woman. She bought 2. Her friend bought 3. By 9 in the morning, Dan had sold all the shampoo, all 12 bottles. He jotted it down in his notebook and circled it. His first best-selling item had been found. Hygiene products. Logical. In a world without industrial chemicals, regular shampoo is a luxury. But Dan wasn't celebrating. He was doing the math. 12 bottles a day. A midnight restock would bring in exactly 20. That means 12 customers. If 20 come tomorrow, he'll have to turn 8 of them away. He needed a system. He took out his notebook and began sketching a table. On the left, the products. On the right, the quantity in stock. At the bottom, a column labeled Daily Limit Per Customer. As he was writing down the numbers, the bell rang. Standing in the doorway was a man Dan recognized, the very same adventurer to whom he had sold a Sprite yesterday. Only now he looked completely different. Clean clothes, a fresh face, a straight back. Behind him stood 2 others. A man in chainmail with an axe at his belt and a woman in a green cloak with a staff. The adventurer said they were his party mates, that he'd told them about the shop, that they wanted to buy the same thing he'd been drinking, the green fizzy stuff. Dan took out 3 cans of Sprite, set them on the counter, named his price, 1 silver coin apiece. The woman with the staff looked at the can with professional interest. She was a mage. Dan could tell by her eyes. She looked at the can the way a scientist looks at a specimen. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. She asked what it was made of. Dan answered, water, sugar, lemon flavor, carbonation. The woman frowned. She said she didn't sense any magic. None at all. Not a trace of mana. That's impossible. A healing potion without mana doesn't exist. Dan shrugged. He said he just sells what's on the shelves. Miracles aren't his specialty. The woman opened the jar and took a sip. The carbonation hit her nose. She sneezed. Then she took another sip, and another. She finished it. Several expressions flashed across her face in quick succession. Surprise, confusion, anxiety, and finally, something resembling awe. She said she could feel her mana restoring, not completely, but noticeably, like after 3 hours of meditation in 30 seconds. Her companion with the axe was already drinking his can and grunting contentedly. The cut on his arm had healed. The bruise on his cheek had turned yellow and faded away. They paid 3 silver coins and left. Dan sat down on a stool. 3 silver coins for 3 cans of soda? In Oregon, that would be $1. Here, 3 silver coins. He didn't know the exact exchange rate yet, but he'd seen that you could buy a chicken for a silver coin at the market. That meant a can of Sprite cost as much as a whole chicken. And people paid without batting an eye? Because in this world, a healing potion costs a gold coin. And a gold coin is worth 100 silver coins. His Sprite cures just as well as a potion and costs 100 times less. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Positioning, the medicinal segment. The entry price for the customer is low. Supply is limited. Recommendation: don't lower the price, don't raise it. 1 silver coin per unit. Fair. He underlined the word fair and put a period. By lunchtime, 16 people had visited the shop. 4 bought soap, 3 wanted shampoo, which was already sold out, and left disappointed. 5 bought soda, 2 just stood there looking at the chocolate display case and sniffing. 1 boy ran in for a second chocolate bar, the same one as yesterday. Dan remembered his face. Redhead, freckles, a hole in his elbow. Dan gave him the bar and took a copper coin. The boy ran off happily. In his notebook, Dan wrote next to his purchase, regular customer number 3, red-haired boy, chocolate. By evening, Dan ran into his first problem. He was running out of soda. There were 4 cans of Sprite, 2 of Coke, and 1 of Fanta left in the fridge. In the morning, there had been 12 of each kind. He'd sold 32 cans that day. That meant exactly the same number would be back on the shelves. But if the rumors keep spreading, and they will, then tomorrow there won't be 16 people coming, but 30, and he'll have to say no to half of them. Dan didn't like saying no. It went against everything his father had taught him. If a customer came, the customer got the product. But his father worked with a supplier he could call to order an extra case. Dan's supplier, however, left notes and didn't answer the phone. Because there was no phone. Dan locked up the shop at 9 and sat down to think. A sheet of paper lay in front of him. He drew a diagram. Total soda volume, 36 cans a day. Demand is rising. Supply is fixed. A classic shortage situation. Solutions. First, raise the price. The market will regulate itself. Dan crossed out this point. No, the price must be fair. He won't trade like a cartel. Second, introduce a limit. 1 item per person per day. Simple and clear. Dan circled this point. Third, diversify. Not everyone comes for soda. Some need soap. Some need bandages. Some need chocolate. If he directs the flow correctly, the pressure on the soda will decrease. Dan wrote in large letters, voucher system. Every customer receives 1 voucher upon entry. The voucher entitles the holder to 1 purchase from the medical category. Other items are unlimited. He cut 20 small rectangles out of a notebook. On each one, he wrote a number and the word voucher. Primitive, but it works. He'll test it tomorrow. At 11 o'clock that night, He set up a folding cot behind the counter. The cot was from the back room of a store in Oregon. He used to sleep on it when he worked the night shift. It had been moved here too. Dan lay down and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was tiled, a familiar ceiling. One tile in the corner had a water stain from a leak 3 years ago. He thought about his mother, about how she sits in a nursing home in Portland and waiting for his visit on Sundays, about whether she knew he was dead or not dead. He didn't know what had happened to him. A bullet had hit his chest. It hurt. Then darkness. Then the counter. He could be dead. Could be in a coma. Could be in the afterlife, which looked like the Middle Ages with swords and magic. Any option sounded crazy. But the shelves were being restocked. Customers were coming in. Coins jingled in the register. And if this was madness, at least it had a work schedule and an inventory list. At midnight, the shelves were full again. A note lay on the counter, in the same handwriting. Delivery complete. Standard assortment. P.S. You're running out of Sprite. I ordered an extra case. D. Dan reread the last line. Then he counted the Sprite in the fridge. Instead of the usual 12 cans, there were 24. The supplier had increased the order, on his own, without being asked. Dan sat down on a stool and stared at the note for a long time. Then he picked up a pen and wrote at the bottom, "Thanks. Could I get some more shampoo, too?" He placed the note on the counter and went to bed. In the morning, the note was gone. In its place, there were 24 bottles of instead of 12. Dan smiled, for the first time in 2 days in this world. The third day began with her. Dan opened the door at 7. 12 people were standing in front of the store. He handed out coupons to the first 20. He asked the rest to come back tomorrow. Someone grumbled, but left. People in Havenbrook were used to shortages. The line entered one at a time. Dan served each person calmly and attentively. "Hello, what do you need? Here's your item. Here's your change. Come back again." A smile for everyone. On the 7th customer, the bell rang especially loud. A man in a city guard's uniform burst through the door. Chainmail, a sword, a red cloak with a coat of arms. Horror on his face. Not anger, not aggression, but the pure, undiluted horror of a father whose child is dying. He threw a bag onto the counter and coins scattered across the wood. Gold. Lots of them. 10. 20. He said his daughter was 5 years old, that she was burning up. The mages said it was putrid fever, that the potion cost 100 gold pieces and wasn't available in the city, that the child had an hour left, maybe 2, that he would give everything, his house, his sword, his life, anything. Dan looked at him. Then he asked a question. "What are the symptoms?" The man swallowed. "Fever. Won't drink water. Vomiting. For a day now. Won't eat. Stomachache. Loose stools. Every hour." Dan listened and did the math in his head. Fever, dehydration, vomiting, diarrhea, a 5-year-old without water for a day. This isn't some magical illness. It's dysentery, or rotavirus, or something similar. In Oregon, it's cured in a day. Rest, electrolytes, small portions, no mystery. He turned to the shelf, took a bottle of Pedialyte, children's electrolyte solution, grape flavor, purple label. Set it on the counter next to the mountain of gold. He pushed the coins back toward the guard, said it was free. The guard froze. His face twisted. He thought Dan was mocking him. He grabbed his sword. Dan didn't back down. He stood behind his counter and looked the guard in the eye. Then he spoke slowly and clearly. 1 teaspoon at a time. Every 10 minutes. No more. If he chugs it, he'll throw up. Let him lie in the cool. Don't wrap him up. Put a wet rag on his forehead. And run. Now. The clock is ticking. The guard stood there for a second. 2. Then he grabbed the bottle and ran out. The door slammed so hard the bell nearly fell off. Dan stood behind the counter. His hands weren't shaking. He gathered the scattered gold coins into a neat pile and set them aside. The guard would come back for them. A woman stood in line by the door, watching Dan. She'd seen everything. Dan looked at her. He smiled. He said, "Next, please." 6 o'clock. The bell jingled. The guard stood in the doorway. He wasn't terrified. He wasn't furious. He stood there, tears streaming down his face, silently. Then he dropped to one knee right on the threshold. He said the girl was sleeping, that she was breathing evenly, that her fever had broken, that she'd asked for a drink and had another. That he didn't know how it was possible. That the healers said it was a miracle. Dan stepped out from behind the counter. He walked over to the guard. He put his hand on the guard's shoulder. He said it wasn't a miracle. That his daughter had been dehydrated. That she needed water with salts and sugar. Nothing more. And that tomorrow morning he should come back for a second bottle, just in case. Free, too. The guard stood up, wiped his face, said his name was Captain Holloway, that he commanded the Havenbrook City Guard, that from this day forward, anyone who laid a finger on this shop or its owner would have him to deal with personally. Dan nodded. He said he appreciated that. Then he pointed to the stack of gold on the counter. He said it was his. Let him take it. Holloway looked at the gold. He shook his head. He said he was leaving it as a deposit, that he would come and buy like everyone else, at a fair price, that he didn't want to be in debt. He wanted to be a customer. Dan looked at him for a long time. Then he held out his hand. Holloway shook it, firmly. It was a handshake worth more than the 20 gold pieces on the counter. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Regular customer number 4. Captain Holloway, City Guard, free Pedialyte. Status? Ally. On the 4th day, Lyra Ashford walked into the shop. Dan didn't know that yet. He only knew that the door flew open with such force that the bell rang like a fire alarm, and a girl appeared in the doorway with a sword on her back and a bruise covering half her face. She was young. Rust-red hair tied back in a ponytail, a dirty travel cloak, a leather breastplate with scratches from claws or fangs. She was almost as tall as Dan. Her eyes were green and angry. She scanned the shop, paused at the shelves, and said one word. Food. She didn't ask for it. She didn't ask. She just said it, like someone who's used to a world that doesn't give but takes. Dan pointed to the shelf with candy bars and snacks. She walked over, took a bag of Doritos, turned it over in her hands, sniffed the bag, then looked at Dan suspiciously. Asked what it was. Dan answered, "Chips, corn, with cheese." She asked how much. 2 coins. She tossed the coins on the counter, tore open the bag with her teeth, and shoved a handful into her mouth. She chewed for 3 seconds, stopped. Her eyes went wide. She looked at the bag. Then at Dan. Then back at the bag. She shoved another handful in, and another. The bag was empty in a minute. She licked her fingers, one by one. Dan watched silently. Then he said that if she needed something for her face, he had some ice. She touched the bruise on her cheekbone and winced. She said it was nothing, that it had been worse. Dan took a bag of ice from the freezer, wrapped it in a clean towel, handed it to her. She looked at him as if he'd done something impossible. Then she took the ice and pressed it to her face. A minute later, the swelling began to go down. Another 5 minutes later, the bruise turned from dark purple to pale yellow. She removed the towel and felt her cheekbone. It didn't hurt. She looked at Dan again, this time without anger, with something else, with interest. She asked his name. Dan. And yours? Lyra. She sat down on the floor right by the counter, crossing her legs. She said she was an adventurer. She went on dungeon runs. She fought monsters. She earned money. It was simple. That yesterday her group had stumbled upon a wyvern's nest south of the city. That 2 of the 4 were seriously injured. That the healer had asked for 5 gold pieces for treatment, but they only had 3. That she'd been hit by a tail and the facial injury was just a minor thing. That she'd come in because a soldier at the market had mentioned a shop selling potions for a silver coin. She'd thought it was a lie. Dan nodded. He asked what had happened to the wounded. Lyra's face darkened. She said they were lying in the tavern. One with a laceration on his thigh, another had 3 broken ribs. Without treatment, the first one might lose his leg. The second one risked a rib piercing his lung. Dan thought for a moment. Then he went to the shelves. He put together a kit, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, a pack of bandages, a tube of Neosporin, 2 elastic bandages, a pack of ibuprofen, Band-Aids, antiseptic wipes. He laid everything out on the counter. Lyra looked at it, confused. Dan explained. For the wound on the thigh, rinse it with this, then apply the ointment from the tube, a thin layer. Cover with a bandage, change the bandage twice a day. For the ribs, a tight bandage with this elastic bandage, around the chest, not too tight, he needs to breathe. 2 painkillers every 6 hours, with water. Be sure to take them with water. Lyra listened with her mouth agape. Then she asked how much. Dan calculated. Hydrogen peroxide, 1 silver. Bandages, 1 silver. Neosporin, 2 silvers. Elastic bandages, 1 silver each. Ibuprofen, 1 silver. Band-Aids, 1 copper. Wipes, 1 copper. Total, 8 silver and 2 copper. Lyra took out her purse. She counted it. She had exactly 10 silver. She dumped everything on the counter. Dan took 8 silver and 2 copper. He pushed the rest back. Lyra looked at the change, then at Dan. The healer takes 5 gold. That's 500 silver. You're taking 8. It wasn't just cheap. It was unthinkable. She shoveled everything into her bag, got up from the floor, and headed for the door. She stopped, turned around, said she'd be back. Dan replied that he'd be waiting. She returned 4 hours later. She burst through the door so hard that the doorbell rang out across the street again. Her eyes were ablaze. The wound on her companion's thigh had closed in 2 hours. It hadn't just stopped bleeding, it had closed. New skin, pink and clean. Neosporin, which in Oregon simply prevents infection, here worked like a regenerative potion. The broken ribs didn't heal instantly, but the pain was completely gone and the guy was breathing freely. Lyra stood in the middle of the shop and looked at Dan. Then she said calmly and seriously, "You know what you just did." Dan said he'd sold the first aid kit. Lyra shook her head. "You just did what an A-rank healer does, for 8 silver. This will change everything." Dan remained silent. He was thinking the same thing. If Neosporin heals wounds and ibuprofen relieves the pain of broken bones, if Sprite restores health and mana, if Pedialyte saves dying children, then every item on his shelves is a potential potion. 240 items. 240 potions that no one else in this world has. And he's the only one who knows what they are and how it works. Because he's been reading labels in his store for 10 years and knows the ingredients of every product. It's not magic. It's inventory management and common sense. Lyra didn't leave. She sat down on the floor by the entrance, took an apple out of her bag, and started eating. Dan asked what she was waiting for. Lyra replied that she wasn't waiting, that she was standing guard. Dan raised an eyebrow. Lyra explained simply. You sell things worth gold for silver. You have no weapons, no security, no magical protection. You're alone in a shop on the outskirts of a trading town. Any mercenary with half a brain will come in at night and take everything, or kill you and take everything. She said this calmly, without drama, like someone who knows how the world works. Dan wanted to object. Then he thought, she was right, absolutely right. He was a merchant, not a warrior. His only weapons were the counter and the calculator in his head. He asked how much she wanted for protection. Lyra smiled. She said she didn't want money, food and a roof over her head. She sleeps in a tavern where there's one room for 4 people and bed bugs. If Dan lets her sleep in the back room and feeds her whatever's on the shelves, she'll stand by the door and make sure no one comes in with bad intentions. Dan thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said there was no back room, but there was space behind the storage shelves. He'd set up a second cot there, and every evening he'd leave dinner on the counter. A microwave meat pie and a can of Dr. Pepper. Lyra blinked. She asked what a meat pie was. Dan showed her the package, a frozen meat pie for the microwave. Lyra looked at the package skeptically. Dan put the pie in the microwave. She stood nearby and watched through the glass as the plate spun inside. When the microwave beeped, Lyra jumped back and grabbed her sword. Dan took out the hot pie. He put it on a plate. He set it in front of her. Lyra sat down on a stool. She picked up the pie with her hands. She took a bite, chewed slowly, closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. She wasn't crying. These weren't those kinds of tears. It was something deeper. Something that happens when a person who grew up in an orphanage and spent their life on the road sits down for the first time at a table where a place has already been set for them, where someone knew they were coming. Lyra finished the pie, wiped her hands on her pants, opened a Dr. Pepper, took a sip, coughed from the fizz, took another sip, set the can down, looked at Dan, said one sentence. I'm staying. Dan nodded, jotted it down in his notebook. Employee number 1, Lyra Ashford. Position, security guard. Compensation, room and board. Starting that night, Lyra slept behind the warehouse shelves on a cot that Dan had found in the back room, which turned out to be there after all. It was just that the door to it had only appeared when it was needed. Dan decided not to think about it too much. On the 5th day, Havenbrook began talking about the shop, not in whispers or through rumors, but in a full voice. At the market, merchants discussed a strange shopkeeper who sold potions without mana. In the tavern, adventurers argued whether it was real or a scam. At the city gates, guards told caravanners that a new alchemist had appeared in town. Captain Holloway came by every morning. He bought a bottle of water for his daughter, who was already running and laughing. He paid a silver coin. He stood at the counter for an extra 5 minutes. He told Dan the city news, who had arrived, who had left, what caravans were expected. This was information you couldn't buy with money. Dan wrote it all down. On the 6th day, the first troublesome customer arrived, a large man in expensive clothes with 2 bodyguards. He walked in without saying hello. He walked along the shelves. He took a can of cola. He opened it. He drank it. He put the empty can on the counter. He said he wanted to buy all the merchandise. All of it. How much does it cost? Dan looked at him, then at the empty can he hadn't paid for. He replied that the merchandise was sold by the piece. The limit was 1 unit of medicinal goods per person per day. The man smirked. He said he was a merchant from the silver frontier, that he was willing to pay 20 gold pieces for the entire stock of soda, right now. 20 gold pieces, 2,000 silver coins, for 36 cans that Dan sells for 1 silver coin each. The math was simple. The man was offering 55 times the retail price. Dan could have agreed. In this world, 20 gold pieces can buy you a house, but then tomorrow, 36 customers would be left without soda. And the day after tomorrow, the rumor that the shopkeeper had sold out to a wholesaler would spread throughout the city. And everything Dan had built over 5 days would come crashing down. He looked the man in the eye. He said no. The man stopped smiling. Lyra rose from her seat by the door. Her hand rested on the hilt of her sword. The bodyguards tensed. Dan didn't move. He said calmly, 1 tankard. 1 silver coin, just like for everyone else. And please pay for the one you've already drunk. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then the man tossed a silver coin onto the counter, turned, and left. The bodyguards followed him. Lyra watched them go. Then she looked at Dan. She said he was an idiot. 20 gold coins, Keen shrugged. He replied that if he sold everything to one person, there would be nothing left for everyone else. And the others are the ones who come every day, the ones who tell others, the ones who make the shop a shop. Without them, he's just a guy with a crate of soda. With them, he's a merchant. Lyra was silent for a second. Then she said he was still an idiot, but a good idiot. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Incident number 1. Attempted bulk purchase. Rejection. Consequences unknown. He underlined the word unknown and fell into thought. The merchant from the Silver Edge didn't strike him as the sort of man who takes no for an answer easily. On the 7th day, Dan realized he needed help behind the counter. Lyra was an excellent security guard, but a lousy saleswoman. She stood by the door with her arms crossed over her chest and looked at the customers in such a way that half of them forgot why they had come. Dan asked her several times to smile. Lyra grimaced. Things were getting worse. The line in front of the shop grew every day. 7 people. 12. 20. 25. Dan couldn't serve everyone before closing time. The ticket system worked, but created a new problem. People came at 6 in the morning to be first in line. They stood in the dark on the cold pavement. They argued. Once, 2 men got into a fight over a spot. Lyra broke them up with a single move. She grabbed both of them by the collar, pulled them apart, and said that the next person to start a fight at her stall would get the pommel of her sword to the forehead. Both fell silent. Dan stood in the doorway and watched. Then he returned to the counter and added a new entry to his notebook. Need an employee. Someone local. Someone who knows the language better. Someone who can count coins. Someone who can stand at the register when he's busy with inventory or sorting goods. The problem solved itself in the form of a knock on the back door. Dan didn't even know the back door existed. It led to a narrow alley between the shop and the stone wall of the neighboring house. A girl was standing in the alley. She was about 16 or 17, slender, with dark hair braided into a plait and large hazel eyes. Poorly dressed. Her dress had been altered twice and was patched at the elbows. Her shoes were worn out, but she was clean, neat. She said her name was Una Park, that her mother was a seamstress and had been sick for 2 months, that they didn't have enough money, that she was looking for a job, any job, mopping floors, carrying boxes, anything, that her neighbor had told her about a shop with wonderful goods and that the owner was kind. Dan looked at her. Then he asked if she could count. Una nodded. Up to how much? Up to 1,000, and back. Dan asked how much 137 plus 254 would be. Una answered without a pause. 391. Dan asked if an item cost 3 copper coins and the customer gave a silver coin, how much change would there be? Una said 7 copper coins. Dan nodded. He said there was a job, from 7 in the morning until 9 at night. Mopping the floor, stocking the shelves, helping behind the counter. Pay is 2 silver coins a day, and dinner. Una opened her mouth. 2 silver coins was more than her mother earned in a week of sewing when she was healthy. She started to say something, but her voice broke. Dan raised his hand. He said she could start right away. Here's an apron, here's a bucket and a rag. Wash the floor from the entrance to the warehouse. Una took the apron. She pulled it on. It was too big for her and hung down to her knees. She rolled up the sleeves and got to work. An hour later, the floor was gleaming. Dan hadn't seen it that clean since he'd hired a professional cleaning service in Oregon for Christmas 2 years ago. Una worked quickly and quietly. She didn't chat. She didn't get distracted. When she finished with the floor, she asked what was next. Dan showed her the shelves. He explained the system. Every item has its place. Labels facing the customer. Neat rows. If something is sold, we move the remaining items to the edge so the shelf doesn't look empty. Una listened with such attention, as if memorizing a spell. 2 hours later, she had arranged 3 shelves perfectly. Dan checked. Not a single mistake. By lunchtime, Una was already standing next to him behind the counter, taking payments. Her hands were small and quick. She counted coins instantly. She gave change precisely. She spoke to customers politely but briefly. "Hello, here's your order. Come back again." Dan watched and nodded to himself. The girl was a natural at the counter. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he sent her home with $2 silver and a paper bag containing a microwave meat pie and a can of Campbell's chicken broth. Una looked at the bag. She asked what it was. Dan said it was leftovers, that they would have gone to waste anyway. She should take it to her mother. The broth is hot. Let her mother drink half a cup. Una pressed the bag to her chest and left, quickly, without looking back. But Dan saw her wipe her eyes with the back of her hand as she walked. He jotted it down in his notebook. Employee number 2, Una Park. Position, assistant. Pay, 2 silver coins a day plus meals. On the 8th day, 2 important events occurred. In the morning, Min-Soo Han came into the shop. Dan noticed her immediately because she didn't look like anyone he'd seen in Havenbrook so far. Short and fragile, with straight black hair down to her waist and facial features that he would have called Asian if he were in his own world. Her ears were slightly pointed. A half-elf. She didn't go to the counter. She didn't ask the price. She walked over to the medicine shelf and began reading the labels, slowly and carefully. She ran her finger along the lines. She moved her lips. Dan watched from behind the register. 10 minutes later, she picked up a package of ibuprofen, walked over to him, and said something that made him freeze. She said that the ingredients listed on the package did not contain a single known alchemical ingredient. No mandrake root, no mana essence, no moon dust, or anything else from the Alchemist's Guild registry. That meant one of 2 things. Either the ingredients were encrypted, or it didn't work with magic. Dan looked at her. Then he asked who she was. Min-Soo introduced herself. She said she was an herbalist, that her mother was a spice merchant from the eastern lands, that she grew up on the road between cities, that she taught herself alchemy from books, that no guild takes half-elves as apprentices, that she makes a living selling herbal ointments at the market, that when she heard about a shop selling potions without mana, she came to check it out. Dan was silent for a second. Then he made up his mind. He pulled a notebook from under the counter. He opened it to a blank page. He wrote, Ibuprofen. Ingredients. ibuprofen 200 milligrams, cornstarch, silicon dioxide, stearic acid, hypromellose coating. He showed it to her. Minsu read it without looking up. Then she looked up. Her eyes were burning. She asked what ibuprofen was. Dan answered honestly, a substance that relieves inflammation and pain. Not magic, chemistry. Minsu crouched down right by the counter. She pulled her own notebook out of her bag, a worn one with a leather cover. She opened it. Inside were hundreds of entries in tiny handwriting, recipes for ointments, proportions of herbs, observations of patients. She looked at Dan and said she wanted to study every item in his shop, every composition, every effect. What if this really isn't magic but chemistry? Then this is the most important discovery in the history of alchemy. It could change the whole world. Dan thought for 3 seconds. Then he said he'd hire her. Position: product researcher. Salary: 3 silver coins a day. The task: take 1 item a day, test it, record the results, organize the data. Minsu looked at him silently. Then she asked quietly, "Aren't you afraid I'll steal your secrets?" Dan chuckled. He said the secrets were written on every package. It's just that no one had bothered to read them before her. Minsu smiled, for the first time during the entire conversation. The smile was small, quiet, and bright. She said one word: "Thank you." Dan took a clean apron out of the drawer. He wrote "Min" on the breast pocket with a marker. He handed it to her. She took the apron with both hands. She looked at the embroidered name. Then she pressed it to her chest and nodded. There were no tears. There were no speeches. Just a person who had been a half-elf and a half-human all his life, putting on an apron with his name on it. His real name. The one someone had taken the trouble to find out and remember. The second event of the day was less pleasant. Toward evening, a man in a gray raincoat walked into the shop. Dan remembered him because the man didn't buy anything. He walked along the shelves, he looked at each one, he touched a can of Coke with his finger, he sniffed the soap, he picked up a pack of aspirin, read the label, and put it back. Then he walked over to Dan. He asked who his supplier was. Dan replied that it was a trade secret. The man smiled. The smile was thin and cold. He said he worked for the Seven Seals Alchemists Guild, that the guild had taken an interest in the new shop in Havenbrook, that trading in medicinal substances without a guild license was a violation of the trade code, that Dan should submit documentation for his goods to the guild council within 10 days, or the shop would be shut down. He placed a rolled-up parchment bearing a seal on the counter. He turned and left. Lyra stood by the door, staring back with her gaze. When the door closed, she turned to Dan. She said this was bad. The Alchemist Guild controls the trade in potions across the 3 kingdoms. They don't mess around. They kill those who trade without a license. Not figuratively, literally. People disappear. Shops burn. And no one saw anything. Dan unfolded the parchment. He read it. A demand for a license. A list of goods. The origin of the ingredients. The name of the master alchemist. The guild's seal. A signature. Inspector Mallory. On behalf of Master Anselm Weir. Dan folded the parchment and tucked it into his notebook. Then he wrote it down. Threat number 1. The Alchemists Guild. 10-day deadline. Decision. No. He underlined no and closed the notebook. Then he looked at Lyra, at Yuna, who was wiping down a shelf in the corner, at Minsu, who was sitting on the floor, carefully applying Neosporin to a glass slide while recording her observations. 3 people, 3 employees, 3 reasons not to give up. He stepped out onto the shop's porch. Havenbrook lay before him in the evening light. Stone houses, tile roofs, smoke from chimneys, people walking home from work. Someone was carrying bread. Someone was leading a child by the hand. An ordinary evening in an ordinary small town. A bell tinkled behind him. Dan turned around. A note lay on the counter. The supplier. He went inside and read it. Dan, be careful of the man in the gray coat. Dan read it again. Then he whispered into the empty space. Thank you. I know. But the note. It was lying on the counter. That meant the supplier could see what was happening inside the shop, could see it in real time. It was both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. Dan put the note away. He closed the shop. Lyra took her post by the door. Min Soo settled into a corner with a notebook. Yuna went home with a bag containing 2 silver coins, a can of broth, and a package of crackers for her mother. Dan lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling. 10 days. He had 10 days to find a solution to the problem with the guild, and he had no idea where to start. On the 9th day, Dan did what he always did when faced with a problem he couldn't solve on his own. He asked a customer. Captain Holloway came in at 8 in the morning as usual. He bought a bottle of water for his daughter. Dan poured him some coffee from the machine, black, no sugar. Holloway took a sip and froze. His eyes widened. He took another sip. Then he looked at the cup, then at Dan. He asked what kind of drink it was. Dan said it was coffee. Holloway said he knew what coffee was, that in Eridan, coffee was brewed from beans brought in from the south, bitter, black, and murky. It cost 5 copper coins a mug. What Dan had made had nothing to do with that coffee. It was something else. Dan nodded. Then he got down to business. He told him about the inspector's visit, about the guild's demand, about the 10 days. Holloway set down his cup. His face hardened. He said that the Alchemist Guild was the most powerful trade organization in Westmarch, that they held licenses from the king for the monopoly trade in potions, that they had kept prices high for the last 100 years, that anyone who tried to trade potions without their seal ended up badly. Dan asked, how badly? Holloway remained silent. That was answer enough. Then Holloway added something important. The guild has a monopoly on potions, but Dan's goods aren't potions. They contain no mana. Min Soo confirmed this. If the goods contain no magic, then technically they fall outside the guild's jurisdiction. It's a loophole. Small and fragile, but a loophole nonetheless. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Strategy. Prove that the goods aren't potions. We need official confirmation from a mage, an independent expert. He asked Holloway where to find such an expert. Holloway thought for a moment. He said there were no mages in Havenbrook. The nearest mage tower was in the capital of Westmarch, a 3-day journey away. But there's one catch. The Tower of the Seven Winds doesn't like the Alchemist Guild. An old feud. Mages think alchemists are charlatans. Alchemists think mages are snobs. If Dan finds a way to contact the tower and ask for an expert opinion, they might agree just to spite the guild. Dan nodded. It was a good idea. But a 3-day journey meant someone had to go and return with an answer before the deadline. 8 days remained, -3 for the trip there, 3 back. That left 2 days in the capital for negotiations. Just barely enough. Lyra volunteered immediately. She said she was the fastest on horseback, that she knew the way, that she could make it in 2 days if she cut through the Grey Pass. Dan looked at her. Lyra stood tall, hand on her sword, her eyes were burning. She wanted to help. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to prove she was worth her meat pie and can of Dr. Pepper every evening. Dan said okay. Then he prepared a kit for her, a letter from him written in 2 languages. In the common language of Erden, and in English, in case there was someone in the tower with an curiosity. Samples of goods: 1 can of Coke, 1 tube of Neosporin, 1 pack of ibuprofen, everything neatly packed. He attached a note to the samples. The ingredients are listed on each package. Not a single ingredient contains manna. Please conduct an independent analysis and issue a report. Sincerely, Dan Carter, owner of Little Wonders General Store. Lyra left the next morning. Dan stood on the porch and watched her ride down Havenbrook's main street on a rented horse. Her cloak fluttered behind her. His sword bounced in its sheath. A bell jingled behind him. Someone had entered the shop. The workday had begun. Without Lyra, the shop felt different, quieter, emptier. Dan hadn't realized how much he'd grown accustomed to her presence at the door, to her comments, to the way she crunched on chips in the corner and grumbled at customers who took too long to choose. Yuna worked silently and diligently. Minsu sat in her corner with a notebook and samples. But an echo that hadn't been there before lingered between the shelves. On the 10th day, Dan decided to do what he always did during times of uncertainty: work. He conducted a full inventory. He sat down at the counter with his notebook and counted every item. He recorded the opening stock. He recorded the day's sales. He calculated the turnover. The result surprised him. In 10 days, he had sold goods worth 120 silver coins and about 400 copper coins, about 1.5 gold coins. Converted to his world, that would be a laughable income. But here, 1.5 gold coins was a craftsman's 6-month salary. He spent nothing on food or shop maintenance. Stock was replenished for free. There was no rent. He hadn't paid any taxes yet. His margin was 100% on every item. It was the most profitable business in the history of Air. And the most vulnerable. Because if the guild shut down the shop, 0 would be just that. 0. On the 11th day, something unexpected happened. A woman Dan had never seen before entered the shop. Tall, light hair pulled back into a neat style. Her clothes were expensive but understated. A gray dress made of fine fabric, thin gloves. On her finger, a ring with a stone that looked more expensive than anything Dan had ever seen in Havenbrook. She moved the way people do who are used to having doors open for them, but she opened the door to Little Wonders herself. A bell tinkled. The woman surveyed the shop, every shelf, every row, every item. Her gaze was sharp and appraising, not like a shopper's, like an investor's. Then she approached the counter. She looked at Dan. She introduced herself. Seraphina Westmarch, 3rd Princess of the Kingdom. Dan's expression didn't change. He didn't bow. He didn't flinch. He said, "Welcome. How can I help you?" Seraphina raised an eyebrow slightly. She had expected a different reaction. Everyone expects a different reaction when a princess states her name. But Dan had worked behind the counter in Portland for 10 years. The mayor of the city came in. Police officers came in. Homeless people came in. Everyone got the same thing. "Hello, how can I help you?" "Come again." A title didn't change the service. Seraphina said she had come on her father's behalf, that King Westmarch was interested in trade relations with the shop, that she was authorized to discuss the terms. Dan nodded. He offered her a seat. The only place to sit was a stool by the counter. Seraphina looked at the stool. Then she sat down, back straight, hands on her knees. She wasn't in a throne room. She was sitting on a wooden stool in a convenience store, and she acted as if that were perfectly normal. Dan respected that. She began talking about contracts, about exclusive supply agreements, about volumes, about prices. Her language was diplomatic, smooth, and polished. Dan listened. Then he asked one question: what exactly the king wanted. Serafina fell silent. Then she answered, "The king wanted the goods from this shop to be sold only in Westmarch, through merchants appointed by the king, at prices set by the crown." This meant that Dan was working for the king, that his shop was effectively becoming royal property, that the prices wouldn't be his, that the customers wouldn't be his. Dan looked at Serafina. Then he said no. She wasn't surprised, as if she'd expected it. Dan explained, if he sold only to Westmarch, they'd kill him. The Silver Edge and the Steppe Horde wouldn't tolerate a monopoly. A war would break out over his shop. He'd become a target. And so would his customers. But if he sold to everyone equally at a single price, he'd be neutral, not an ally, not an enemy, a merchant. Everyone has an interest in him living and working. It's safer for him, for Westmarch, for everyone. Serafina listened. Her face was inscrutable. Then she asked a question Dan hadn't expected. She asked where he was from, not which city, where, because she had traveled through 3 kingdoms and never once met a merchant who would refuse a king for the sake of his own safety and then explain to the king why it was in the king's own best interest. Merchants don't think that way. Someone else does. Dan paused. Then he told the truth, that he was from far away, that in his country, trade works differently, that there's a rule there. A buyer isn't a walking wallet. A buyer is a person, and if you treat them like a person, they come back, again and again, and that's more profitable than fleecing them once. Serafina was silent for a long time. Then she stood up. She said she would pass on the answer to her father, that she expected him to refuse, but that she personally believed Dan was right. She turned and walked toward the door. Dan said, "Wait." She turned back. Dan opened the freezer. He took out a popsicle, vanilla with chocolate coating. He held it out to her. Serafina looked at the ice cream, then at Dan. She asked what it was. Dan answered, "Ice cream. Milk, sugar, vanilla, and chocolate. Frozen. Delicious. It's free for you." Serafina took it. She unwrapped it. She took a bite. The coating cracked. The cold vanilla melted on her tongue. Serafina stood motionless, the ice cream in her right hand, her left hand clenched into a fist. She wasn't crying. Princesses don't cry. But her lips trembled, and she quickly turned away toward the window. Dan pretended not to notice. He wiped the counter with a rag, rearranged the jars on the shelf. When Serafina turned back, her face was calm, perfectly calm. She finished her ice cream. She placed the stick on the counter. She said quietly, "No one had ever bought her food. Just like that. For no reason. Without a contract. Without conditions. She is a princess. She is served on silver platters. But every dish is a deal. Every gift is an expectation. Every smile is a calculation." And the shopkeeper, out of nowhere, gave her an ice cream on a stick and asked for nothing in return. Dan shrugged. He said it was a hot day. The ice cream was melting. Someone had to eat it. Serafina looked at him for a long time. Then she said she would stay in Havenbrook for a few days for further negotiations. Dan nodded. He said the shop was open from 7 in the morning until 9 at night, every day. Serafina walked out. The bell jingled. Una stood behind the snack shelf and looked at Dan with wide eyes. She whispered, "It was a princess, a real princess." Dan nodded. He jotted it down in his notebook. Client, Serafina Westmarch. Status, princess. Purchase, 1 ice cream. Price, 0. Note, will return. He underlined will return and smiled. By the evening of the 12th day, Lyra hadn't returned. Dan wasn't worried. She said 2 days one way, plus time for negotiations. That's normal. On the 13th day, Serafina came back. She bought a chocolate bar, paid with a copper coin, sat down on a stool. She ate the chocolate in silence and watched Dan work. How he served customers, how he smiled at everyone, how he remembered names. How he asked old Martha if she needed help carrying her bag. Martha lived 3 houses down. Dan found that out on the 2nd day. Ever since then, every Tuesday when Martha came for milk, Una would carry her groceries to the door. Serafina sat there for an hour, then 2, then 3. The chocolate had long since run out. She just sat there and watched. Min-Soo worked nearby at a makeshift table made of boxes. She dripped a drop of hydrogen peroxide onto a cut apple and recorded the reaction. Una served customers at the register with the seriousness of a surgeon in the operating room. Dan counted the inventory and made notes in his notebook. Before closing, Serafina stood up. She walked over to the counter. She asked if she could come in. Not as a princess, not as a representative of the crown, just as a customer. Dan looked at her. He replied that the shop was open to everyone, from 7 to 9, every day, and that tomorrow would be hot, and if she came by 10, he'd show her what a Slurpee was. Serafina didn't understand the word, but she nodded and left. On the 14th day, Lyra returned. She stumbled through the door, dirty and tired, with a torn cloak and shining eyes. She tossed a rolled-up parchment with a heavy seal onto the counter. She said that the Tower of 7 Winds had sent an official report. Dan unrolled it. He read slowly. The gist was simple. The mages of the tower had conducted a full analysis of the 3 samples. The result? None of them contained mana. In any form, in any quantity. The goods are not potions as defined by the trade code. They are substances of unknown origin with effects unrelated to magic. Signed, Archmage Keldrick, Seal of the Tower of 7 Winds. Dan placed the parchment on the counter. He looked at Lyra. Lyra smirked. She said the Archmage had personally conducted the analysis, that he'd opened a can of cola and drunk it for 40 minutes straight, that he'd then asked for another one for retesting, and that he'd very much like to discuss supplies with Dan. Dan laughed. For the first time in Airden, he laughed. Then he took a can of Dr. Pepper and a meat pie out of the fridge. He set them in front of Lyra. He said, "Welcome home." Lyra looked at the can, at the pie, at the counter. Then she sat down on her stool by the door. She opened the can, took a sip, and said quietly so that only Dan could hear, "Thank you. Not for the food, just thank you." Dan nodded. He jotted it down in his notebook. Day 14. Conclusion from the tower received. The goods are officially not potions. The guild has no jurisdiction. Lyra is back. Everything is going according to plan. He emphasized everything is going according to plan, even though up until that moment there had been no plan. There was only the counter, a notebook, and a bell above the door, and people, who for some reason kept coming back. On the 15th day, Dan handed Inspector Mallory a parchment bearing the seal of the Tower of 7 Winds. Mallory arrived right on schedule. The 10th day, a gray cloak, a faint smile, 2 bodyguards behind him. He expected to see a frightened shopkeeper with a sack of gold in his hands, ready to bribe his way out. Instead, he saw a counter behind which stood Dan, holding a notebook in one hand and a parchment in the other. Lyra stood nearby with a sword at her belt. Una sat by the door, wiping down a shelf with such indifference to what was happening as if the guild inspectors came by every Tuesday. Min-Soo, in the corner, did not look up from her notes. Dan placed the parchment on the counter and turned it to face Mallory. Official conclusion of the Tower of Seven Winds, signed by Archmage Keldrick. Seal. Contents. The goods of the Little Wonders shop do not contain mana and are not potions as defined by the Westmarch Trade Code. Mallory read slowly. His expression did not change, but his fingers turned white at the edges of the parchment. He read it twice. Then he rolled it up and put it back. He looked at Dan. He said that this solved nothing, that Master Weir would find another way, that the tower might be wrong, that there would be a second examination. Dan nodded. He replied that he was ready for any examination, that his doors were open, that he would gladly provide samples to any official, and that if the inspector wanted, he could buy something. The soap was excellent. The shampoo, too. Mallory looked at him with a long, unblinking stare. Then he turned and walked out, bodyguards behind him. Lyra exhaled. She said this wasn't the end, that the guild wouldn't stop, that Weir wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. Dan nodded. He knew. But they'd gained 10 days, and every day gained meant new customers. New connections. New people who knew the shop existed and that its products worked. The more people depended on the shop, the harder it would be to destroy it. It wasn't magic, it was marketing. On the 16th day, Seraphina arrived at 10 in the morning, just as she had promised. Dan showed her what a Slurpee was. The Slurpee machine had been sitting in the corner of the shop from day one, but Dan hadn't turned it on because he didn't see the point. Now he turned it on. The machine hummed. Ice began swirling inside the transparent drum. Cherry syrup colored it red. Seraphina stood nearby and watched, spellbound. Dan filled a cup. He stuck a straw in it. He handed it to her. Seraphina took a sip through the straw. She paused. She closed her eyes. Cold. Sweetness. Cherry. Something that didn't exist in a world where ice cream is made from goat's milk and honey and costs a fortune per serving. She opened her eyes and took another sip. And another. And another. On the 5th sip, she froze and clutched her nose. Her face contorted. Dan said it was normal, that it's called brain freeze, that you have to press your tongue against the roof of your mouth and wait. Seraphina pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth. The pain subsided after 5 seconds. She looked at the glass with resentment. Then she took another sip. More carefully. More slowly. Una giggled from behind the counter. Seraphina shot her a look. Una fell silent, but the corners of her lips trembled with suppressed laughter. Seraphina finished her Slurpee. She set the cup down. She paid 2 copper coins. Then she asked if she could help out in the shop. Dan raised an eyebrow. Seraphina explained. She had come to negotiate. The negotiations had failed. Dan had refused. She had written to her father. The reply would arrive in a week. Until then, she was stuck in Havenbrook. The tavern was boring. The shop was interesting. She wanted to understand how trade worked without titles and seals. Dan thought for 3 seconds. Then he asked if she could write beautifully. Seraphina looked at him as if he'd asked if a fish could swim. She was a princess. Calligraphy since age 6. 4 languages, 3 types of fonts. Dan gave her a task. Write price tags for every item on the shelves. Legibly, large, beautifully. Item name, price. A brief description of the effect in the Erden language. Seraphina sat down at the table made of crates next to Min-Su. She picked up a quill and ink. She began to write. An hour later, every shelf held price tags so beautiful that shoppers stopped just to read them. The princess's calligraphy transformed soap, 3 copper coins, cleanses the skin, pleasant scent, into a work of art. Min-Su looked at the price tags, then at Seraphina. then at her own notes written in clumsy, small handwriting. She said nothing. She went back to work. Dan watched the two of them, the princess in a gray dress and the half-elf herbalist in an apron with her name embroidered on it, sat at the same table and worked. One wrote price tags, the other studied the composition of hydrogen peroxide. Neither spoke to the other, but there was something between them. Not hostility, not friendship, a cautious acknowledgement that the other person was here too, needed to, part of something new too. On the 17th day, Dan received a letter. Not a note from the supplier, a real letter delivered by a courier on horseback. The seal of the Alchemist Guild of the Seven Seals. Addressed to the owner of the Little Wonders shop. Dan opened it in front of everyone. Lyra stood nearby. Seraphina sat on a stool. Minsu looked up from her notes. Yuna froze with a rag in her hand. The letter was from Master Anselm Veer himself. The content was simple. The Guild does not recognize the tower's conclusion. The Guild considers the shop's goods to be demonic counterfeits. The Guild demands an immediate cessation of trade. In the event of refusal, the Guild will appeal to King Westmarch with a demand to close the shop as a threat to public order. The deadline is 5 days. Dan folded the letter. He put it away in his notebook. He looked at Seraphina. Seraphina was staring at the wall. Her face was stony. She said that the Guild really could appeal to the king, that they had leverage, that the Guild pays enormous taxes to the crown, that the king wouldn't want to quarrel with them over a single shop. But there was a catch. She was a princess. She had seen the goods with her own eyes. She had seen the tower's report. And she would write a second letter to her father, not as a diplomat, as a daughter. Dan looked at her. He asked why she was doing this. Seraphina paused. Then she said that in 3 days in this shop, she had seen things she hadn't seen in 24 years in the palace. A man who speaks to a princess and a laundress the same way? Who charges the same price to the rich and the poor? Who treats you to ice cream, not because he wants something in return, but because it's a hot day? She said that if a shop like this closed, the world would become a little worse. And she doesn't want to live in a world that's a little worse when she can prevent it. Dan was silent. Then he nodded. He said thank you, and that if she writes a letter, she should mention that the shop is willing to pay taxes, the full percentage, just like any merchant in Westmarch. Seraphina raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. The Guild will accuse him of trading illegally. The best response is to be more legitimate than the Guild itself. Taxes, a general merchant's license, bookkeeping, everything out in the open, everything transparent. Let them check. Seraphina looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize, surprised that a shopkeeper from nowhere was thinking 3 steps ahead. She took out a pen and paper and began to write. On the 18th day, Dan faced a new problem. There were too many customers. The line at the door stretched to the end of the street. 40 people in the morning, 50 by noon. There weren't enough tickets. People waited for hours. Some came from neighboring villages. A farmer drove half a day in a wagon to buy soap. An adventurer walked 20 leagues to buy bandages. A mother with a sick child stood in line for 3 hours to get a bottle of Pedialyte. Dan looked at the line and counted. 36 cans of soda, 24 bottles of shampoo, 12 bars of soap, 10 packs of bandages, 8 tubes of Neosporin, 6 bottles of Pedialyte. That was his daily supply. Fixed, unchanging. It wasn't enough for 50 people, let alone 100. He couldn't increase the shipment. The supplier increased individual items, but the total volume remained roughly the same. as if there were a ceiling, a capacity limit. Dan sat down at the counter and thought. In Oregon, when demand exceeded supply, the answer was simple. Order more from the supplier. That didn't work here, so he needed a different answer. He opened a notebook. He wrote in big letters. Problem. Demand exceeds supply by a factor of 3. Solve the problem. Then he began listing options. First, raise prices. Crossed out. Second, tighten the limits. Already done, not helping. Third, prioritization. Who to sell to first. Dan pondered this point. Who is more important, a sick child or an injured adventurer? An old woman who needs soap or a warrior who needs soda to restore his mana? Everyone is important. But if we serve everyone equally, there won't be enough for anyone. He wrote down the categories of buyers. First, emergency care, sick children, seriously injured, life-threatening situations, no line, free, or at cost. Second, regular customers, those who come every day, Holloway, Martha, the red-haired boy. They receive coupons in advance. Third, new customers, general line, 1 coupon per medical item, the rest without restrictions. It was like a hospital triage system. Dan never thought he'd be applying medical logic to retail, but this wasn't an ordinary store. Minsu approached him in the evening, quietly, as always. She placed her notebook on the counter, open to a specific page. Dan read it. These were the results of a 2-week study. Every product had been tested. Every effect recorded, classified, systematized. Sprite. Restores health and mana. The effect is proportional to the degree of exhaustion. On a healthy person, the effect is minimal. Coke. Similar to Sprite, but with an additional invigorating effect. Relieves fatigue, increases concentration for 2 to 3 hours. Side effect. Fatigue returns after 3 hours. Fanta. Restores mana more effectively than Sprite, restores health less effectively. Dr. Pepper. Unique effect. Increases magic resistance for 4 to 6 hours. Reason unknown. Neosporin. Tissue regeneration. Cuts heal within an hour. Deep wounds within a day. Does not work on broken bones. Ibuprofen. Grade A painkiller. Reduces inflammation. Accelerates bone healing by 2 times. 2 tablets every 6 hours. Pedialyte. Neutralizes low and medium-level poisons and infections. Restores fluid balance. Primarily used for children and the infirm. Shampoo. Cleanses, strengthens hair. In mages, it increases to mana for several hours. Side effects of unknown nature. Soap. Cleanses. Has a mild anti-magical effect. Washes away weak curses and the evil eye. Chocolate. Restores mental energy. Relieves the effects of magical exhaustion. Improves mood. The effect is stronger for mages. Chips. Satisfying. Restores physical stamina. No magical effects, just very tasty. Dan read the list and felt a chill run down his spine. 240 items, each with a unique effect, some mundane, some incredible. Soap washes away curses. Shampoo amplifies magic. Dr. Pepper provides magical protection. He looked at Minsu. She was standing nearby, waiting. Quiet, serious, her hands clasped in front of her. Dan said this was the most important work anyone had ever done in this shop. Minsu didn't smile. She didn't blush. She just nodded. But he saw how she straightened up slightly, how her shoulders squared, how her chin lifted a millimeter. He said he wanted her to compile a complete catalog, every product, every effect, dosage, contraindications, everything she could determine. It would be Erden's first pharmaceutical reference guide, and on the cover would bear her name. Minsu blinked. Then she asked quietly, "Her name?" Dan nodded. Min Han, researcher, author. She lowered her head. Her hair covered her face. Dan didn't look. He just went back to his notebook and started writing a plan for tomorrow. A minute later, Min Soo returned to her corner and opened her notebook. Her hand with the pen moved faster than usual. By midnight, the shelves were full. A note from the supplier lay on the counter. Delivery completed, standard assortment. P.S. Nice catalog. Keep it up. Dan reread it. The supplier knew about Min Soo's catalog. The supplier approved. It was strange and reassuring at the same time, as if somewhere out there, beyond comprehension, someone was watching over this little shop and quietly nodding. On the 20th day, a reply came from the king. Serafina received the letter by messenger early in the morning. She read it standing on the shop porch. Her face betrayed nothing. Dan waited behind the counter. Lyra sharpened her sword by the door. Yuna arranged the merchandise. Min Soo wrote in her notebook. Everyone waited. Serafina entered. She placed the letter on the counter. She said 2 words. He agrees. The King of Westmarch will not close the shop. Moreover, he is issuing Dan a general merchant's license, a full one, with all rights and obligations. Tax, 10% of turnover. The standard rate for any merchant in the kingdom. No special conditions, no exclusivity. The Little Wonders shop was becoming a legal business in Westmarch. Dan took the letter. He read it. He looked at the seal. Royal. Genuine. A heavy, red wax seal with 2 swords and a tower. He folded the letter and put it in his notebook. Then he looked at Serafina. He said thank you. Serafina shrugged. She said it wasn't her, that her father had made the decision himself, that he wasn't a stupid man, that he understood Dan's argument about neutrality, and that he didn't like the Alchemist Guild lately. Too much power, prices too high, too few potions on the market. A small shop that sells medicinal goods cheaply and legally is a convenient counterbalance. Not a threat to the guild, just a reminder that a monopoly isn't eternal. Dan nodded. Politics. He didn't like politics, but he understood it. In Oregon, the city council played the same games, only the stakes were lower. Here, the stakes involved swords and magic and people who vanished into the night. He jotted it down in his notebook. Day 20. License obtained. Legal status, 10% tax. Next step? Grow. Growth started with the little things. Dan rearranged the display. In Oregon, he knew that products at eye level sold 3 times better than those on the lower shelves. That bright packaging attracts attention. That grouping by purpose works better than grouping by type. He rearranged everything. Health products together, soda and beverages together, hygiene products together, food together. Each group had price tags written in Serafina's calligraphic handwriting. Next to each product was a small card with a description of its effects written by Mins. A customer would walk in and immediately see what they needed. They didn't wander the aisles in confusion. They didn't ask Dan every 30 seconds. They simply read the card and made a decision. The time spent serving a single customer dropped from 5 minutes to 2. The shop's throughput doubled. Dan introduced another innovation: loyalty cards. Small rectangles of thick paper. Each had the customer's name and 10 blank boxes. Each purchase was 1 stamp. 10 stamps earned 1 free item from the everyday category. Soap, chocolate, chips. Not medicinal, but nice. He handed the first card to Captain Holloway. Holloway turned it over in his hands, read it, looked at Dan, asked why. Dan explained. It's a reward for loyalty, for coming every day, for telling others, for standing by us when things get tough. Holloway tucked the card into the breast pocket of his chainmail, where the most important things are kept. On the 22nd day, Dan stepped outside the shop for the first time on business. He went to the city market. Lyra walked beside him, her hand on her sword. Her eyes scanned the crowd. Dan carried a basket of samples. Havenbrook Market occupied the central square, wooden stalls under awnings, vendors selling meat, bread, fabrics, tools, the smell of spices and manure, the cries of hawkers, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a neighboring workshop. Dan walked through the rows. He didn't buy anything. He looked. He counted. He memorized. Bread prices, meat prices, fabric prices, candle prices. He was looking for what was missing, and he found it. There wasn't a single hot food vendor in Havenbrook. There were bakers, there were butchers, but no one sold ready-to-eat hot food. Food you could buy and eat right then and there, standing up, on the go, without a plate or a fork. In Oregon, a hot dog from a cart cost $2. Millions bought them, every day, because it's fast, cheap, and tasty. Dan went back to the shop. He opened the freezer. He counted the hot dogs. 20 of them. Hot dog buns. 20. Ketchup. Mustard. He took the electric hot dog rotisserie out of the back room. It had been sitting in the corner since day one. Unplugged, unneeded. Until now. He plugged it in. It started working. The rollers began to spin. Dan placed 4 sausages on them. 10 minutes later, the shop smelled of hot dogs. Lyra lifted her head from her corner. Her nostrils flared. She stood up and walked over to the rotisserie. She stared at the spinning sausages as if hypnotized. Dan assembled the first hot dog. A bun, a sausage, a line of ketchup, a line of mustard. He handed it to Lyra. She took it with both hands, took a bite, chewed, her eyes closed. When she opened them, her expression was as if she had found the meaning of life. She said one word: more. Dan sold 20 hot dogs in 2 hours. Customers who came in for soap or bandages stopped at the rotisserie and couldn't leave. The smell did all the work. 3 copper coins apiece. Cheap, filling, hot. People bought 2 at a time. Some bought 3. Red-haired boy, regular customer number 3, ate 2 hot dogs and sat on the floor by the counter with an expression of absolute bliss. On the 25th day, Cassandra Reinhold appeared. She didn't enter the shop. She stood on the street across the way and looked at the sign. Tall, broader in the shoulders than Lyra. Short, dark hair. A scar running from her right ear to her chin. Leather armor over chainmail. 2 swords crossed on her back. Her eyes were gray and tired. She stood and watched. A minute. 2. 5. Then she went inside. The bell tinkled softly, as if even it sensed that this person should be treated with caution. Lyra tensed. Her hand rested on the hilt. She recognized the type. A mercenary. A professional. High level. People like that don't walk into shops for chocolate. Cassandra walked up to the counter. She looked at Dan. For a long time. Then she said that 2 weeks ago her sister had been dying. A wound on her stomach from a blade poisoned with pale mold. The healers gave up. They said the poison was already in her blood, that there was no chance. For 3 days, Cassandra sat by the bed and watched as the only person close to her faded away. On the 4th day, one of her fighters dragged a package from a shop in Havenbrook, a small tube of white ointment, and bandages, and some pills. Cassandra applied the ointment to the wound, bandaged it, gave her the pills. 6 hours later, the wound had closed. 12 hours later, her sister opened her eyes. A day later, she was up and about. Cassandra fell silent. She stood at the counter and said nothing. Dan waited. Then she said she hadn't come to buy anything, that she'd come to ask a question. Whether he needed security. Real security, not just some girl with a sword. No offense to the girl with the sword. Lyra opened her mouth to object but kept quiet. She knew the difference between herself and a professional mercenary with 20 years of experience. Cassandra said she had a squad, 12 fighters, experienced, loyal, that she'd take the shop under full protection, not for money, for supplies, bandages, ointment, painkillers, for her people, who risk their lives every day and can't afford a healer. Dan thought for exactly 5 seconds. Then he held out his hand. Cassandra shook it. Her grip was iron. Dan didn't flinch. Then he did what he did every morning for Holloway. He turned on the coffee maker, poured a cup, black coffee, 2 sugar cubes, set it in front of her. Cassandra looked at the cup, then at Dan. He said she looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. Cassandra didn't answer. She took the cup, took a sip, closed her eyes. Dan saw her shoulders sag a centimeter, how the fingers of her free hand relaxed, how the wrinkle between her eyebrows became slightly smaller. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, spoke softly. No one noticed. Dan didn't understand. No one noticed that she was tired, that she hadn't slept, that she was carrying everything on her own. Her fighters saw a commander. Her enemies saw a threat. No one saw the person who needed a cup of coffee with 2 sugar cubes. Dan shrugged. He said that noticing that was his job. Cassandra looked at him. Then she nodded. She stood up, walked to the door, stopped, turned around, said that starting tomorrow, 2 of her fighters would be on duty at the shop around the clock, and that every morning she would come for coffee. Dan replied that the coffee would be ready by 7. He jotted it down in his notebook. Employee. No. Ally. Cassandra Reinhold. Former captain of a mercenary squad. 12 fighters. Payment. Medical supplies. Status. Security. Dan underlined security and looked at Lyra. Lyra was sitting on a stool, biting her nail. Dan walked over to her. He told her she had nothing to worry about, that she came first, that Cassandra was guarding from the outside and Lyra was guarding from the inside. They were different things. Lyra looked at him. Then she muttered that she wasn't worried. She stood up and went to check the back door. Dan smiled. He jotted it down in his notebook. Note: Lyra is jealous, not of the woman, of the role. Solution: give her a different role, more important than guarding. He didn't know what yet, but he knew he'd figure it out. On the 30th day, Havenbrook had changed. Dan saw it every morning when he stepped out onto the porch. The street in front of the shop, which a month ago had been a quiet alley, had now become a commercial thoroughfare. To the right of Little Wonders, a bakery had opened. To the left, the tavern had expanded its patio and set up tables on the street. Across the street, the blacksmith had hung a new sign. People walked to Dan's shop and stopped by his neighbors on the way. They bought bread, they drank ale, they ordered horseshoes. Dan was lifting the whole neighborhood simply by existing. That's what they call an anchor tenant. In Oregon, big stores pay shopping centers for the right to be an anchor because they draw in the foot traffic. Dan didn't pay. He just opened at 7 and closed at 9, and the foot traffic came on its own. The guild wouldn't give up. Mallory showed up every 3 days. He didn't come in. He stood on the opposite side of the street and watched. He jotted down in a notebook. He counted customers. He assessed them. Cassandra's fighters stood by the door and stared back at him. Mallory would leave. He'd return in 3 days. He'd stand there again. He wrote again. It was a siege. Quiet, methodical, patient. The guild was waiting for the moment. Dan knew it and was preparing. He couldn't attack. He was a merchant, not a warrior. But he could build. Every new customer was a brick in a wall that was harder to destroy. On the 32nd day, he launched a new project. He called it to himself Courier Service. The idea was simple. Not all customers could come to the shop. The elderly, the sick, mothers with babies, people from villages half a day's journey away. If the mountain won't come to Mohammed, they didn't know that saying in Erden. Dan explained it differently. If the customer can't come, the goods go to the customer. He hired 3 boys from town. Red-haired regular customer number 3 was the first volunteer. His name was Tommy, 13 years old, fast on his feet, knows every alley. His 2 friends were just as quick on their feet. Dan gave them instructions. Every morning they'd get a list of orders. They'd pick up the goods, deliver them to the addresses, collect payment, bring the money back to the shop. 1 copper coin per delivery. The boys were happy. A copper coin for a run through town was more than they earned begging in a week. The first delivery went to old Mrs. Martha. A bottle of milk and a bar of soap. Martha opened the door, saw Tommy with a bag, and smiled so widely that wrinkles appeared from her ears to her chin. She gave Tommy an extra copper coin on top. A tip. The first tip in the history of Erden. Dan wrote it down in his notebook. By the end of the first week, the delivery service was serving 20 addresses a day, 10 in the city and 10 in nearby villages. The village orders were larger. Farmers bought soap by the case. Their wives ordered shampoo. The children asked for chocolate. Sales volume grew by 30%, without expanding the product range, simply by expanding the service area. On the 35th day, Dan realized he needed a scaling plan. A single shop in a single city was a vulnerability. If the guild burned it down at night, it would all be over. He needed branches. He needed a network. He needed a structure that could survive an attack on a single point. He gathered everyone in the evening after closing time. Lyra, Serafina, Minsu, Yuna, Cassandra. 6 of them behind the counter. He handed each of them a can of cola, opened his own, took a sip, then he began to speak. He said he wanted to open a second shop in the capital of Westmarch. There are more people there, more demand, and most importantly, the guild wouldn't dare act openly there. The capital is the king's territory. The guards are stronger. The law is stricter. If Little Wonders opens in the capital, it will send a signal. The shop isn't hiding. The shop is growing. There was one problem. The supplier restocked the shelves only at this shop, only at midnight, only here. If we open a second location, the goods will have to be transported from Havenbrook. 3 days on the road, logistics losses, limited volumes would become even more limited. Minsko raised her hand, quietly, as always. Dan nodded at her. She said she had an idea. That for the past 2 weeks, she hadn't just been studying the products, she had been trying to recreate them. Not copy them exactly, that's impossible, but to create analogs, local versions, from local ingredients, based on the principles she gleaned from the ingredient lists on the labels. For example, soap. She knows what works in Dan's soap. Lye, fatty oils, fragrance additives. Erden has all of that. Olive oil, ash from certain trees, mountain flowers for fragrance. She made 3 bars of soap using her own recipe. They don't lift curses like Dan's soap, but they clean, they smell good, and they're cheap because the ingredients are local. She put 3 bars on the counter. Dan picked one up, sniffed it. Lavender. Turned it over. Smooth, solid, well made. He looked at Minsu, then at the others, then back at Minsu. He said, "This solved the problem." The second shop wasn't required to sell only Oregon products. It could sell local equivalents. Minsu soap, Minsu ointments, Minsu shampoos. Basic goods that don't heal wounds or lift curses, but that are 10 times better than what's available on the Airden market. And goods from the main shop would be delivered once a week, in small batches, like a premium line. It was marketing, pure marketing. 2 product lines, basic, affordable, made from local ingredients, Minso as creator and manufacturer, and premium, original goods from that very store. Rare, expensive, with that special effect. Serafina listened in silence. Then she spoke up. She said she knew of a suitable space in the capital, on Trade Street, a former spice shop that had closed after the owner couldn't pay the rent. A good location, high foot traffic, reasonable rent. She could work something out. Dan nodded. Then he looked at her. He asked if she wanted to run the shop in the capital. Serafina froze. Then she spoke slowly. She run the shop. She's a princess, Dan replied. That's exactly why. No one would touch a shop run by a princess. It's the best protection possible. But that's not the point. The point is that over the past 3 weeks, he'd seen how she worked, how she wrote price tags, how she talks to customers, how she counts the takings at night, how she remembers names. She's not just a princess playing shop. She's a merchant, a natural one, who's just never stood behind a counter before. Serafina was silent. Silence hung over the shop. 5 pairs of eyes were watching her. Then she straightened her back. She said she needed an apron, with her name on it. Dan took a clean apron out of a box, wrote on it with a marker, Serafina. He held it out. She took it, looked at the letters, ran her finger over the embroidered name. The 3rd Princess of Westmarch, in a merchant's apron with a name written in marker from another world. She put it on, tied it in the back, looked at Dan, nodded. Lyra cleared her throat, said that if Serafina was going to the capital, someone had to protect her, that she was volunteering, that the capital was dangerous than Havenbrook, that a princess without a sword is a sitting duck. Dan looked at her. Lyra tried not to meet his gaze. He understood. Lyra didn't want to stay behind the warehouse shelves while others were building something new. She wanted to be at the forefront, on the front lines, where it's dangerous and exciting. He nodded. He said that Lyra would go with Serafina, security and logistics. She would escort the weekly shipments from Havenbrook to the capital and ensure the safety of the new outpost. Lyra straightened up. For the first time during the conversation, she smiled. Not a smirk, a smile, wide and open. Then she quickly turned away and pretended to check the strap on her scabbard. Ka Sandora said she would assign 4 fighters to the capital shop. Minso said she would prepare a batch of local soap and ointments within a week. Yuna said she was staying in Havenbrook and that she could handle the main shop while everyone else was away. Dan looked at her. Yuna was 17. She had been working at the shop for 3 weeks, but she knew every item on every shelf, every price, every regular customer by name. She could calculate faster than Dan. She smiled, sincerely, not professionally. The customers loved her. He nodded. He said she would manage the Havenbrook shop in his absence, temporarily, with full responsibility, a salary of 5 silver coins a day. Yuna opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, said she wouldn't let him down. Her voice trembled, but her hands were steady. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Expansion plan. Point 2. The capital of Westmarch. Manager Serafina. Security. Lyra and 4 of Cassandra's fighters. Merchandise. Local equivalents plus a weekly shipment of originals. Opening date? In 3 weeks. He underlined the date. Then he raised his can of Coke. 5 cans rose in response. 6 cans clinked together with a soft tinkle. Dan took a sip. The Coke was warm. He didn't pay any attention. It tasted just like home. Preparations for the opening of the downtown store took 18 days. Dan spent them in a state he called launch mode back in Oregon. When his father opened the chain's second location, Dan was 16. He remembered how his father hadn't slept for 3 days straight. He checked deliveries. He hired staff. He calculated the budget. He argued with the electrician. He drove to the warehouse twice at 4 in the morning. And on opening day, he stood behind the counter, looking fresh and smiling, as if he'd slept for 12 hours. Dan was his father's son. He didn't sleep. In the morning, he worked in the shop. In the evening, he made plans. At night, he kept records. The notebook had grown to 3 notebooks. The first, the main shop, inventory, sales, regular customers. The second, the downtown location, budget, rent, stock, staff. Third, Minsu's research, catalog of effects, recipes for local analogs. Serafina left for the capital on the 12th day of preparation. With her went Lyra, 4 of Cassandra's fighters, and a cart with the first shipment of goods. Local Minsu soap, 30 bars. Local ointments made from mountain herbs, 20 jars. Local mouthwash. Minso created them using peppermint oil and local antiseptic plants. Not as effective as Listerine, but 10 times better than nothing. Plus a small box of original goods, 10 cans of soda, 5 tubes of Neosporin, 3 packs of ibuprofen, 2 chocolate bars, the premium line, twice the price of what they cost in Havenbrook. Not because Dan wanted to make a profit, it's because transportation cost money. Lyra traveled 3 days one way. That's her time, her risk, her horse. It was included in the price. Dan explained this to Seraphine before leaving. She nodded. She understood. Dan gave her one final instruction, just one, the most important one. Treat every customer the same. The duke and the laundress, the mage and the peasant. A smile? Hello, how can I help you? Please come again. These aren't just words. It's a philosophy. If you stick to it, everything else will fall into place. Seraphina listened intently. Then she repeated it. Hello, how can I help you? Please come again. Her voice was steady, confident, princely. Dan shook his head. Speak softer, warmer, as if you're glad to see this particular person, not because he's a customer, because he's come to visit you. Seraphina paused. Then she tried again. Hello, how can I help you? This time her voice was different, not princely, human. Dan nodded. He said it like this. She left at dawn. Dan stood on the porch and watched as the wagon drove out of the city gates. Lyra rode alongside. She turned around once. She raised her hand. Dan raised his hand in response. Then he went into the shop. Una was standing behind the counter. Her apron was tied tightly. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was serious. She said she was ready. Dan nodded. He said he believed her. He opened the door. He flipped the sign. The workday began. Without Lyra and Seraphina, the shop seemed big. Dan worked behind the counter. Una took the money. Minsu made soap in the back room, which had now turned into a small workshop. Cassandra came every morning for coffee. She sat on a stool. She drank in silence. She looked at Dan. Then she left to check the posts. On the 45th day, a letter arrived from Seraphina. Dan read it aloud in the evening behind closed doors. Una and Minsu listened. Cassandra stood against the wall with her arms crossed. The shop in the capital had opened 3 days ago. The first day, 12 customers. The second day, 30. The third day, 50, and a line out on the street. Minsu's soap sold out in half a day. The ointments in 2 days. The soda sold out in an hour. Seraphina wrote that the capital was different. People were richer, better informed, more demanding. But the reaction is the same. surprise, distrust, one sip, and eyes wide. She wrote that merchants on neighboring streets were giving them dirty looks, that representatives from two aristocratic houses had already come with offers, that she turned them both down, just as Dan taught. The same price for everyone, no exclusivity. And that Lyra almost got into a fight with the bodyguard of one of the lords who tried to take the goods without paying. She didn't fight because Serafina gave her full name and title. The bodyguard turned pale and paid double. Dan smiled. He jotted it down in his notebook. Capital outpost, launch successful, sales are rising, standard problems, solution, Serafina is handling it. On the 48th day, what Dan had been waiting for happened. The guild struck. Not at the shop in Havenbrook, at the convoy. Lyra was transporting the weekly shipment from Havenbrook to the capital. A cart with goods, 4 fighters on horseback, Lyra in the lead. Halfway to Grey Pass, they were met. 12 mercenaries. No insignia, no coats of arms, professionals. They silently blocked the road. Lyra dismounted. She put her hand on her sword. Cassandra's fighters lined up, 4 against 12. The mercenaries didn't attack. Their leader stepped forward. He said they had a simple business. Goods. They'd take the cart. Everyone would live. Everyone would go their separate ways. No problems. Lyra replied that whoever touched the cart would have problems. The leader smirked. 12 swords left their sheaths at once. The fight lasted 4 minutes. Lyra later said those were the worst 4 minutes of her life. Not because it was scary, because the mercenaries were good. Very good. The guild spared no expense. 2 of Cassandra's fighters were wounded, 1 seriously. A sword pierced through his chainmail and entered his side 2 fingers deep. Lyra killed 3. The fighters killed 2 more. The remaining 7 retreated when they realized the cargo wasn't worth such losses. They fled into the forest. The wagon was intact. The goods were intact. The people were alive. But one of the fighters was bleeding out on the side of the road. Lyra tore open a tube of neosporin from the supply. She applied it to the wound, bandaged it up, gave him ibuprofen. An hour later, the wound had closed. 2 hours later, the fighter was sitting and drinking Sprite. 3 hours later, he was back on his feet. Lyra drove the convoy to the capital. She went to Serafina. She told her what had happened. Serafina wrote an urgent letter to Dan and sent it by pigeon. Dan received it the next morning. He read it. He sat down at the counter. He stared at the wall for a long time. Then he called for Cassandra. Cassandra arrived 10 minutes later. Dan showed her the letter. Cassandra read it. Her expression didn't change. She said she had expected this, that the guild had moved from threats to action, that the next strike would be stronger, more people, better armed. Or the strike would be not on the caravan, but on the shop. Arson at night, poison in the goods, an assassin in the alley. She knew all the options because she herself had been a mercenary for 20 years and had carried out similar jobs. Dan listened. Then he asked what to do. Cassandra looked at him. She answered directly. 2 options. First, strike back. Find mercenaries. Strike at the guild's assets. Show that the shop has teeth. Dan shook his head. No, he wouldn't fight. That wasn't his style. Cassandra nodded. Option 2. Politics. Make it so that an attack on the shop would cost the guild more than the shop itself. He needed allies, strong ones, influential ones. People who wouldn't benefit if the shop closed. Dan thought. Then he opened his notebook. He wrote a list. Captain Holloway, City Guard, needs the shop to treat soldiers. Archmage Keldrick, Tower of the Seven Winds, needs the shop to supply mages. King of Westmarch, needs the shop as a counterweight to the guild. Seraphina, Princess, personal interest. Lyra, Adventurers, a community that depends on cheap medical supplies. Cassandra, Mercenaries, professional warriors who need medicine. The citizens of Havenbrook, whose neighborhood grew thanks to the shop. He looked at the list. 7 groups, each with its own interest. Each stands to lose if the shop closes. It wasn't an army. It was a customer base. And a customer base that fights for your shop is stronger than any army. He wrote in big letters, strategy, lunches. Cassandra raised an eyebrow. Dan explained. Every week, he would invite one influential person to lunch at the shop. Coffee, a hot dog, chocolate, conversation. Not a plea. Not a plea for protection, just lunch. During which business is discussed, during which relationships are built, during which a person feels like a guest, not a customer. Cassandra looked at him. Then she said quietly that in 20 years of mercenary service, she had seen generals, commanders, and kings, and not one of them had waged war like a shopkeeper from nowhere. Not one of them had thought to defeat the enemy with lunches. Dan shrugged. He said this wasn't war, it was business. And in business, the winner is not the one who strikes harder, but the one who is valued more. He jotted it down in his notebook. Day 49. The supply train was attacked, casualties minimal. Response? Diplomacy from behind the counter. Goal? Make the shop indispensable. By midnight, the shelves were full. A note from the supplier. Dan, supply increased. Bandages ×2. Neosporin ×2. Ibuprofen ×2. Take care of your people. Dan read it. Then he wrote at the bottom, Thank you, I will. The first lunch took place on the 52nd day. The guest was Archmage Keldrick. He arrived in Havenbrook in person. Dan hadn't expected this. He had sent an invitation via Holloway, who passed it to a messenger who delivered it to the Tower of Seven Winds. Dan was expecting a reply. Instead, one fine afternoon, a portal of blue light appeared in front of the shop, and out of it stepped an old man in a white robe with a silver beard down to his waist and a staff topped with a crystal that glowed like a small sun. Cassandra grabbed her swords, her fighters lined up in a row, the customers scattered to the sides. Yuna dropped her rag. Minsu looked up from her notes and froze with her mouth open. Archmage Keldrick stood in front of the Little Wonders shop and reading the sign with an expression of restrained curiosity. Then he entered. He ducked under the lintel. The staff nearly knocked over the shelf of chips. He stopped in the middle of the shop and looked around. Dan stood behind the counter. He looked at the Archmage. The Archmage looked at the shelves. Then they looked at each other. Dan said, Welcome. How can I help you? Keldrick grinned. He said he'd received an invitation to lunch and that he couldn't ignore it. Because the last time he'd tried the contents of a jar from this shop, he hadn't slept for 3 days while writing up the analysis results. Dan nodded. He offered him a shelf. The stool looked comical next to the Archmage in his white robe. But Keldrick sat down. He leaned his staff against the wall. He put his hands on his knees and looked expectantly at the counter. Dan prepared lunch. A hot dog, coffee, a chocolate bar, a can of Fanta. He laid it all out on the counter. Keldrick looked at the food, then at Dan, then back at the food. Then he picked up the hot dog, took a bite, chewed slowly. His expression changed with every passing second. Surprise, pleasure, thoughtfulness. He swallowed. He said there wasn't a drop of manna in this sausage, but that it restored physical energy better than a second-rank vitality potion. How? Dan replied that it was protein, fat, and carbohydrates. The energy is contained in the food itself. You don't need manna to feed the body. The body knows how to draw energy on its own. Keldrick froze with the hot dog in his hand. His eyes grew sharp. He said that for 200 years, Eridan's alchemy had sought a way to infuse manna into potions so they would work. That every potion is manna plus a carrier. That without manna, a potion doesn't work. That's an axiom, the foundation of all alchemical science. And here before him was a hot dog in a bun with ketchup that worked without manna. Because the energy was already inside. Because the body itself knows what to do. He set the hot dog down. He looked at Dan. He said this wasn't a business deal. It was a revolution. Dan shook his head. He replied that it wasn't a revolution. It was breakfast. And that if the Archmage wanted, he could get a breakfast like this every week, delivered to the tower for free. Keldrick narrowed his eyes. He asked what the catch was. Dan said there was no catch, just a service, free of charge. But if the shop ever needs help, expertise, protection, a mage's word in court, he hopes the Archmage will remember the hot dogs on Tuesdays. Keldrick was silent. Then he laughed, loudly, heartily, so much so that the crystal on his staff flickered. He said that in his 120 years of life, people had tried to bribe him with gold, artifacts, lands, titles, and women, and for the first time, they were bribing him with hot dogs. Dan replied that they weren't bribing him, they were treating him, just this once. Keldrick finished his Fanta. He belched from the carbonation. He wiped his beard. He stood up. He said he would accept the shipments to the tower. That an expert assessment would be provided upon first request, and that if the guild tried anything, the Tower of Seven Winds would speak out publicly and unequivocally. Dan held out his hand. Keldrick looked at it. Archmages don't shake hands with merchants. It's beneath their status. Keldrick shook Dan's hand, firmly. Then he turned and walked out. A portal flashed open on the street. Keldrick stepped into it and vanished. The customers who had crowded around the door stood with their mouths agape. Yuna, behind the counter, gripped the edge of the countertop with her white fingers. Min-Su sat on the floor, quickly scribbling something in a notebook. Dan closed the door. He flipped the sign to open. The bell jingled. He wrote it down in his notebook. Ally number 3, Archmage Keldrick, the Tower of Seven Winds. Condition? Hot dogs on Tuesdays. The second lunch took place 5 days later. The guest was different, quieter, more dangerous. Evelyn Kerr arrived without warning. She knocked on the door after closing time, 9 o'clock in the evening. The shop was dark. Only the lamp above the counter was on. Yuna had already gone home. Min-Su was dozing over her notebook in the corner. Cassandra was standing by the back door. Dan opened it. A woman stood on the threshold. Short, thin, dark hair pulled back into a careless bun. Thin framed glasses. A pen behind her ear. A worn notebook in her hands. Simple clothes. A travel coat. Boots covered in mud. She said her name was Evelyn Kerr, that she wrote for the Capital Herald, that it was the only independent newspaper in Westmarch, that she had come from the capital specifically to see the shop with her own eyes, and to write about it. Dan looked at her. Then he stepped aside. He invited her in. Evelyn entered. She looked around the shop. She touched the shelves. She read the price tags. She peeked into the refrigerator. She opened and closed it 3 times, delighted that it was cold inside. Then she sat down on a stool and took out a notebook. She said she wanted to ask some questions. Dan replied that he had a condition. She writes the truth. Only the truth. No embellishment. No demonization. If the product heals, she writes that it heals. If the product is just soap, she writes that it's just soap. No sensationalism. No scandal. Just facts. Evelyn looked at him over her glasses. She said that's exactly how she works. And that's exactly why half the capital's aristocracy would like to see her in a ditch. Dan poured her some hot cocoa. Hot. From powder. With marshmallows. Evelyn took the cup in both hands. Sniffed it. Took a sip. A marshmallow stuck to her nose. She didn't notice. Took another sip. Closed her eyes. She said that in her 26 years of life, she had drunk many things, but had never tasted anything like this. Dan handed her a napkin, pointed to her nose. She wiped off the marshmallow. She didn't blush. A pro. For the next 2 hours, she asked questions. Dan answered. Where the goods came from. Trade secret. How they work. Minsu would explain better. Why so cheap? Because a fair price is the foundation of trust. Why is he doing this? Because it's his job. He's a shopkeeper. Evelyn wrote without stopping. Her pen flew across the paper. She didn't use abbreviations. Full sentences. Exact quotes. Every 20 minutes, she reread what she'd written and corrected inaccuracies. Dan watched. He saw something familiar in her. The same obsession with accuracy that Minsu had. The same dedication to her craft. Only Minsu was devoted to science, and Evelyn was devoted to the written word. When the questions were over, Evelyn put away her notebook. She looked at Dan. She said she would write an article, an honest one. That the article would be out in a week. That after it, Dan would be known throughout Westmarch. Not as a miracle worker, not as a heretic, as a shopkeeper who sells strange things at a fair price and smiles at every customer. Dan nodded. Then he asked if she wanted more cocoa. Evelyn looked at her empty cup, then at Dan. She said yes, and that if he didn't mind, she'd come by once a week, for cocoa, and for a chat. Because in the capital, no one discusses her articles with her. They're edited, they're cut, they're censored. No one reads them all the way through or tells her what they think. But Dan read the sign on her notebook and asked how long she'd been writing, and that was the first question about her as a person, not as a tool. Dan poured her a second cup. He put 2 marshmallows in it. Evelyn took it. She took a sip. The marshmallow stuck to her nose again. This time she wiped it off herself and smiled slightly. Dan jotted it down in his notebook. Contact number 5. Evelyn Kerr, journalist. Capital Herald. Hot chocolate on Fridays. Article in a week. Potential. Huge. On the 58th day, the article came out. Evelyn sent a copy via pigeon. Dan unfolded the newspaper on the counter. Yuna and Minsu read over his shoulder. The article took up half the front page. The headline was simple. A shopkeeper from nowhere. Evelyn wrote about the goods, about the prices, about the tower's conclusion, about Captain Holloway and his daughter, about the coupon system, about the loyalty cards, about how at Little Wonders a princess and a laundress stand in the same line. Every fact is verified. Every quote is accurate. Not a word out of place, not a word untrue. The last line of the article read, "In a world where the elixir of immortality costs 3 kingdoms, there is a shop where a bar of soap costs 3 copper coins and where the owner remembers every customer's name." Dan put down the newspaper. He looked at Yuna. Yuna was smiling. He looked at Minsu. Minsu nodded. Quietly. Seriously. Approvingly. He tucked the newspaper into his notebook. Next to the royal license. Next to the tower's verdict. Next to the supplier's notes. Documents of a small shop that was becoming something greater. By evening, a letter arrived from Serafina. In the capital, the newspaper had sold out completely. People had been in line at the shop since 5 in the morning. 3 aristocratic houses have sent invitations to dinner. She turned down all 3. Just as Dan had taught her, same price, same treatment, no exclusivity. And one more line at the end. The Alchemists Guild had called a general meeting, the first in 7 years. The topic? The threat to market stability. Dan read it, folded the letter, sat down at the counter, looked at the bell above the door, a small brass bell that his grandfather had hung 60 years ago in Oregon. It had survived 3 decades, 2 countries, a single bullet, and a journey to another world. The bell swayed quietly in the draft. It tinkled. Dan nodded to it like an old friend. Then he opened his notebook and began planning the coming week. On the 60th day, Magister Anselm Weir summoned Dan to a public hearing. The official summons arrived via a messenger in chainmail bearing the guild seal on parchment. The hearing was scheduled to take place in the capital of Westmarch in 10 days. The Chamber of Commerce Hall. Attendance mandatory. Subject: illegal trade in substances of unknown origin, threat to public health, undermining of economic stability. Demand: complete cessation of operations of the Little Wonders shops within the territory of the 3 kingdoms. Dan read the summons while standing behind the counter. Yuna froze with a rag in her hand. Minsu looked up from her notebook. Cassandra stood by the door and stared silently at the parchment. Dan folded the summons and put it away in his notebook. Then he poured himself some coffee, took a sip. Hot. Bitter. Good. He looked at Cassandra. He asked if she had ever been to a Chamber of Commerce hearing. Cassandra nodded. Once, 12 years ago. Her squad had been accused of damaging property in a hired warehouse. The chamber sat for 3 hours. The verdict was handed down in 5 minutes. A fine of 100 gold pieces. Justice didn't matter. What mattered was who paid the judges. Dan nodded. He asked who paid the judges of the Chamber of Commerce. Cassandra answered without hesitation. The Alchemists Guild. They're the biggest taxpayer. They fund half the judges. They control the system from the inside. The hearings aren't a trial. They're a show with a predetermined ending. Dan finished his coffee. He set down the cup. He said that in that case, they'd have to rewrite the ending. He wrote 4 letters that evening. The first to Seraphine. We need a preparation room in the capital. Quiet. Safe. For a week. The second to Lyra. We need an escort for a convoy of goods to be displayed at the hearings, the widest possible selection. The third to Archmage Keldrick. An invitation to serve as an expert witness at the hearings, in exchange for a year's supply of coffee. The fourth to Evelyn Kerr. An invitation to cover the hearings for the Capital Herald, exclusive. The letters were sent out with the morning pigeons. The replies arrived within 3 days. Serafina. The room is ready. A room above a shop in the capital. Clean, warm, with a view of Trade Street. Lyra. The caravan leaves the day after tomorrow. Heavy security. 8 of Cassandra's fighters. Keldrick. I'll be there. I'm waiting for coffee. Evelyn. I wouldn't miss it for all the treasures in the world. On the 65th day, Dan left Havenbrook for the first time. He stood on the shop porch with a travel bag in his hand. Yuna stood behind the counter, apron tied, back straight. Her face was serious and slightly pale. Minsu stood next to her, a notebook under her arm. Dan looked at them. He said the shop was in their hands, that he trusted them, that he'd be back in a week, that if there were any problems, Holloway would help, that the restocking would be at midnight as usual, that they should collect the notes from the supplier and not throw them away. Yuna nodded. She said she'd manage. Her voice was firm. Min-Su nodded silently. Dan turned and walked toward the gate where the wagon was waiting. Cassandra rode with him. 4 fighters on horseback flanked them. The journey to the capital took 2.5 days. Cassandra took a shortcut via the eastern route, which was longer but safer. Dan sat in the cart and looked at Airden. He had spent 2 months within the 4 walls of the shop and on the streets of the small town. Now he was seeing the world. Fields of wheat stretching to the horizon, villages with thatched roofs, rivers with wooden bridges, dark, dense forest that smelled of pine needles and something else. Mana. He recognized that scent, sharp and electric, like before a storm, only here it was constant, spreading through the air like moisture. But faint. Fainter than in Havenbrook, as if the world were breathing shallowly. Cassandra rode alongside in silence. She wasn't talkative. Dan appreciated that. But on the second evening by the campfire, she spoke up. She asked why he was fighting at all. He had a shop. He had merchandise. He had money. He could close the doors and live quietly, sell in whispers, only to his own. Why did he need hearings? Why did he need the guild? Why did he need this world at all? Dan stared at the fire. Then he answered. Because he was a shopkeeper. And a shopkeeper without customers is just a man with shelves. A shop doesn't exist for the owner. A shop exists for those who walk in. If he closed the doors, Captain Holloway won't be able to buy water for his daughter. Martha will be left without soap. Red-haired Tommy without chocolate. Wounded adventurers without bandages. Sick children without electrolytes. Every day the shop is closed is someone's pain that he could have prevented but didn't. He paused. Then he added, and another thing. His father never closed the shop. Not once in 30 years. Not during a hurricane, not on Christmas, not when his mother left, not when he was diagnosed with cancer. He stood behind the counter until the very last day. Because customers will come. They always come. And someone has to be at the register. Cassandra listened. Then she was silent for a long time. Then she said quietly that she understood. That her father was a blacksmith. That he, too, never closed his workshop, and that he died at the anvil with a hammer in his hand, and that it was right. They sat by the fire in silence. Dan drank cola from a can. Cassandra drank coffee from a thermos. The stars above Airden were different, not like the ones over Oregon, bigger, brighter, closer, as if the sky had tilted to get a better look at 2 people by a small fire. The capital of Westmarch came into view on the 3rd day, just around a bend in the road. Dan saw the walls first. Tall, stone, with towers every 100 meters. Beyond the walls, the roofs of thousands of houses. The spires of temples. The Mage's Tower on the hill, white and slender as a needle. Smoke rising from thousands of chimneys. The noise of the markets could be heard half a mile away. The city was 20 times larger than Havenbrook, and Dan's shop was already there. Serafina met them at the gate. She stood in an apron with her name embroidered on it over a gray dress. Next to her was Lyra with a sword, 4 fighters, and a crowd. About 20 people stood behind Serafina and looked at the cart. Customers from the capital's shop. They had come to greet the owner. Dan climbed down from the cart. He looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at him. Silence. Then someone shouted, "It's him! The shopkeeper!" And the crowd smiled. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. An elderly woman in an apron pushed her way forward and pressed a still warm pie into his hands. She said it was from her, for the soap that had cured her husband's eczema. Dan took the pie. He said thank you. Then he looked at Serafina. She was smiling. Not a princely smile, a human one. Lyra stood nearby and grinned. Dan noticed that they were both tanned, that Lyra had a new scar on her arm, that Serafina's hands were stained with soapy water, that they both smelled of lavender, of Minso soap. He nodded. He said, "Let's go. There's a lot of work to do. 5 days until the hearings." Dan guided them through the preparations. In the morning, he worked at the shop in the capital. He stood behind the counter next to Serafina. He served customers. "Hello, how can I help you? Please come again." The customers in the capital were different, louder, more confident, more demanding. But their reaction to the goods was the same: wide eyes, trembling hands, quiet amazement. In the evenings, he prepared for the hearing. He sat in the room above the shop with his notebooks. 3 notebooks. Facts, figures, arguments. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an orator. He wasn't a politician. He was a shopkeeper, and he was going to speak like a shopkeeper. On the 69th day, the evening before the hearings, Dan sat alone in the room. Lyra was asleep downstairs. Serafina had gone to the palace. Cassandra was checking the posts. It was quiet. Dan opened the notebook. On the last page lay a note. From the supplier. He hadn't left it on the counter in Havenbrook. He'd left it here. In the capital, in the room above the shop. Dan picked up the note. He read it. Dan, tomorrow will be a difficult day. Remember who you are. Not a hero, not a mage, not a king. A shopkeeper. That is your strength. It always has been. Signed, the supplier. P.S. I'm proud of you. Dan reread the last line. Then he folded the note and tucked it into the breast pocket of his apron, right where Holloway keeps his loyalty card. He lay down on the bed, stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was unfamiliar. No tiles, wooden beams, but the lamp was shining just the same.